Hi, everybody. I'm Art Markman, director of the IC² Institute at the University of Texas at Austin, where our mission is to better understand and support remote and small communities to become more collaborative and resilient. As part of our Best Practices series, today's roundtable will discuss the role, reality, and future of rural journalism. We have with us faculty experts at UT who actively lead research efforts on this matter. So we'll have them introduce themselves, and we'll start with Kathleen McElroy.
As he said, I'm Kathleen McElroy. I'm director of the School of Journalism and Media at UT Austin. I care greatly about rural journalism. I worked for very small papers in Texas, and I still see our rural journalism being the heart and soul of a state this big. It's so important that we support rural journalism and see its significance in communities.
And next, Joe Straubhaar.
Hi, I'm Joe Straubhaar. I'm a professor in journalism and media also. And I grew up in a very small town in Idaho, and I've always continued to be interested in how small towns are doing. And I've done a couple of projects in small towns, including one of the ones that we're researching here over the years in Zapata and Zavala and some other places. And really quite interested in how those towns are doing.
And finally, Wenhong Chen.
Hi, everyone. I'm Wenhong Chen. I'm Associate Professor of Media and Sociology at the School of Journalism and Media. And I'm also founding co-director of the Center for Entertainment and Media Industries at the University of Texas at Austin. My work has been focusing on digital media industries and entrepreneurship, as well as digital inclusion. And thankful to IC²'s support, together with Professor George Straubhaar, we have been doing this project, Gloom or Bloom in the media wilderness, media and entrepreneurship in rural and small town Texas.
Well, we're so glad that you're all here today to talk with us. And to get started, I want to really think a little bit about what the current landscape is for rural media, particularly in this current context with the pandemic and other economic woes in small communities. And Kathleen, why don't you get that started for us?
I've been reading the coverage of COVID in these communities, and it is remarkable, the journalism that's being produced by these very small, I mean, literally mom and pops, staffs. It has taken its toll in terms of advertising in some sense. It's also very difficult because a lot of these places were not set up to be as remote as, it's easier in Houston or Austin or even a suburban town. So the idea of trying to cover a meeting that might or might not be on Zoom or done well and still trying to reach your deadlines has been a tremendous, tremendous struggle. But these editors and publishers have really stepped up, and they're still trying to produce quality journalism under extraordinarily trying conditions.
Yeah, it's from what I've been able to see, looking at we're looking at Zapata down on the border, Marfa out in West Texas, and then Taylor just north of Austin. And one pattern we see is that some towns really are truly isolated, like Marfa. And then you'll have a newspaper, and if you're lucky, like Marfa, maybe a public radio station that are really vital local media and that do a lot to kind of keep news lively in the town. When you look at places like Taylor or Zapata, they've got a somewhat different situation because they're kind of under the media umbrella of a nearby town, of a nearby city. Laredo in Zapata's case, or Austin and Taylor's. And I think in some ways that's almost harder to try to have a local newspaper when you're also covered by bigger city newspapers. But they are doing remarkably good coverage. And like Kathleen was saying, they respond to what's going on. There's a lot of coverage in all of those towns now of COVID. The coverage tends to be very local. What's going on here? How are the authorities responding? What aid are we getting from the state? What is the city and the Chamber of Commerce and others doing? So yeah, I think they're really responding to the crisis quite well.
I think first of all, this is a very complicated picture. And if we look at some of the national research For instance, if we use data from the University of North Carolina's News Desert project, and we can see that in many counties, in particular rural counties, many counties have no local newspaper anymore. And half of all the counties in the US have only one newspaper, and normally weekly. And if we zoom in Texas, as Joe just shared, in Texas, there are also about 20 counties without a newspaper, and more than 100 counties with only one single newspaper. And among the three communities, we have conducted our interviews. They have all very unique situations, as Joe just pointed out. For instance, Taylor has a very active local newspaper. Marfa has a newspaper and also public radios, but Zapata is a very different story. And many of these newspapers already experiencing a lot of challenge before the pandemic. And since the pandemic, they are continuing contributing to the local economy, the local business community, or entrepreneurial ecosystems. But at the same time, we can see very similar, like other small businesses in their community, they are struggling and they need support.
Excellent. So to pick up on something that that Joe is saying, local papers in rural areas are really they're really playing a vital role right now in local coverage. And I'm wondering if you can talk, if all of you can talk a little bit more about some of the critical roles that local media are playing in rural areas that go beyond what people in those communities might be able to get from national media or media from larger cities around them.
Well, for one thing, there's very little coverage of local events. I mean, even if you have the Laredo Times 60 miles away or the Austin Statesman 30 miles away, they're not going to cover things in those cities. And so it's kind of, I think it's sometimes a struggle to have, you have a paper which is kind of going to have fairly few staff. If they're lucky, they can hire a reporter or two. Like those Zapata paper has, I think, one reporter and basically one person doing everything else. And so it becomes a bit of a struggle to go beyond press releases and a bit of a struggle to actually get out and do reporting. But I think they're doing as much as they can.
There's no way the American Statesman is going to cover the local school board meeting or COVID, coverage of small towns between here and Houston. And, to what both Joe and Wenhong are talking about, these publications are the ones at these school board meetings or announcing that, hey, our school is going to be open up in spite of COVID, or this is our level, or some of these publications are literally counting the hospital beds available for COVID patients and non-COVID patients. And there's no way a bigger publication can give you that kind of hyper local, to use a term from the early part of this century, about this, about this very, very, again, hyper local coverage. So that is of course, one of the things that they bring.
As a scholar of social media and social networks, it's become very clear to me talking with local business owners that local newspapers and the radio stations, they have to generate and maintain social capital. And in particularly during these very challenging times since the pandemic. We have been following three newspapers in Taylor Press, in Marfa, Big Bend Sentinel, and Zapata, the Zapata County News Weekly. And before COVID, we already played a very important role as cheerleaders of local small business, as connectors that bring different stakeholders in the community together. And also very important, as Kathleen just underscored, they are the information hub. They are the information brokers that are focusing on what's going on in the local communities. And that's a role like a regional media or national media could not and would not fulfill. So this role become even more important since the pandemic. For instance, several of our interviewees point out that the local newspaper have the information about PPP, about what's going on in the community in terms of resources relevant to COVID response, and also how their coverage of the struggle of the local small business, like them to have this opportunity to really feel like, you know, they are not just respond to the pandemic as one single business, as you know, one small part of the community, but they are all in this challenge together.
And if I could add on to that, you know, I ended up judging the South Texas Press Association contest, which were very small papers. I mean, it ranged from Fredericksburg, which is very well financed, to really tiny weekly papers. And what got me is that in many instances, it is this newspaper that holds the community together. There are photos of Little League, of bake sales, of the weekly lunches at the senior citizen place, just the amount of photos of the community. And you realize that this is a kind of glue, you know, even in great times, that these papers are the community itself. They are a reflection of the community. So I just wanted to add that, you know, we're talking about COVID, but these publications to me are just more than vehicles for news.
And it's interesting. One of the challenges they face is what to do with social media and the newer media that are kind of in some ways encroaching on their turf in an advertising way by, you know, competing for their advertising income, which is a challenge for them. And so they're thinking about how other means of support, but they're also being kind of clever. I was looking at the Zapata paper the other day, and they're actually using Facebook very cleverly themselves. You know, they reach people now that they didn't reach in print through Facebook. And so I think it's interesting. You know, I think they have a challenge which research can probably help with. You know, how to live with the new digital media landscape.
This is also a pattern we have been observed. Actually, similar to, you know, national newspapers such as the New York Times or Washington Post, the local newspapers, they are also have this disruption of their business model. So on the one hand, many of the small businesses in the communities, they use local newspaper for advertising. On the other hand, our interviewees also point out, compared with digital media, for instance, Facebook, local newspaper often have, of course, limited outreach. And they also have the problem of not giving local small business owners the type of metrics that so straightforward, so visible when compared with digital platforms. And it's very interesting when we talk with our interviewees, several of them point out they are advertising in local newspapers, not because of the impact or effect on their business outcomes, but as a support to community media. And because both the local media and the local business, they see this as a symbiotic relationship. And some even point out they feel like they are making a contribution to the community newspapers by advertising on them. And all the three communities we studied, we of course have access to regional newspapers and also TV stations. But I think as Art already mentioned, many of these small businesses, they had a very hard time to attract any earned media attention, for instance, from statesmen, right, or from any of the major TV stations. And oftentimes, they don't have the resources to advertise in TV channels or in regional newspapers. So I think, you know, it's really on the one hand show us how local media and the local business, they are actually one important entrepreneurial ecosystem. They depend on one another, they contribute to one another. And on the other hand, it shows that if the local media suffer, the local community and the business community also suffer. And if they thrive, they will thrive together. So this is really a extremely critical time for our state officials and also, I think, stakeholders in big cities close to our rural community to see it's a time for us to act.
You know, right, it is a very symbiotic relationship, as you put it. You know, and the other interesting thing is we're talking about, you know, the digital transformation, and COVID forced those that were not digital to become digital. So there is that. But, you know, it is this kind of thing is using social media as a form of engagement, but not for advertising in particular, because you're right, you have to protect the revenue that you can get. Only the New York Times and the Washington Post maybe can make money off just, you know, the digital sales. So there's this thing that's going on that I think a lot of many publications are now more digital than what they used to be. Yeah. And they're figuring out even how to transform some of those ads. In some cases, what we're seeing is really almost like a PDF of the pages online, but that works. I mean, that's been proven to be a success in a lot of communities outside of Texas to literally PDF your paper. So I think we're going to see different types of digital, you know, news, you know, and again, Texas, by the way, is a huge state, as we all know, 254 counties, that's all in our heads. So one thing to remember is that if we say 10 papers died in the state of Texas, that's bad. We don't want it to happen. There was a horrible situation in Castroville right now, which the San Antonio report wrote about. But there are still lots and lots and lots of rural papers out there. And what we're trying to figure out is how to support and sustain to make it less almost a cult of personality or mom or pop operation. And how can we as a state ensure the sustainability of rural journalism? Well,
this has been a great discussion. And so to really try to wrap this up, I want you to comment on one thing, which is the University of Texas is, of course, a great research university. We're also we teach people all over the state. So as we think about moving forward into the future, what do you see as the role that a university like UT can play, both on the scholarly side and on the teaching side, to help support rural media?
Well, one of the things I would love to do is create a certificate or some sort of program that will build the next generation of publishers and editors. We think that we can start matching these small publications with people who would love to go back to their hometowns. Maybe you worked for the Dallas Morning News or for the Houston Chronicle, and now you want to come back to a small town and help run it. There have been some hits and misses, and this happening, almost accidentally. And I think we at the University of Texas can play a greater role in creating a program that helps sustain succession of these media outlets.
I really want to support Kathleen's point. I remember she convoked a meeting last year that I went to, and I found it utterly fascinating how many of the small town papers were facing a secession crisis. You had aging proprietors who wanted to keep the paper going and wanted to find the next owner, publisher to come in. And I think we could do a lot with both networking and training, helping guide journalism graduates toward those kinds of opportunities, or helping people who are from the area who need a little bit more training in order to take over that kind of role.
I'd like to add that we are very thankful for the work of IC² in terms of supporting our project, and it's opened my eyes. And second, I think there are much more we can do as a university, in particular the flagship. And I think it's our responsibility, first of all, as educators, to train the next generations of journalists and media professionals that are interested and able to operate in this challenging media landscape. And we can also play the role as connectors. We can bring different stakeholders together through conferences, workshops, focus groups, in particular, as the two themes in the project that Joe and I are doing together. We see local media first, they are small business. And second, they are for small business in their community. And we are thinking down the road, as our project move forward, we want to work together, of course, with IC² and with our home unit, School of Journalism and Media, but also community leaders, how we can share our findings, both for better operation of local media, as well as how business, media, and the other institutions can work together.
Well, thanks so much. Wenhong, Joe, Kathleen, appreciate you taking the time today to talk with us a little bit about your work with rural journalism. And for those of you who are interested in finding out more about what we do here at the University of Texas with small communities around the state, you can check out the IC² website at ic2.utexas.edu.